MC Light says hip hop is being put in museums because they don't want erasure. They want artists to be recognized. And then she names out specifically Black women artists. And this is where I'm saying this is where. So I went and I put the link already in the show description to some other work on this topic around museums, but I went and read another article on the subject. I think I literally paused the series right there and went and looked and found a number of interesting articles, and I'll just share this one. Art of the Americas Revisited. What does it mean to decolonize a museum? And this is the point I keep making, that museums are not, this is being put in a museum in this context in particular. I wrote here, this is entombed people, histories, and movements. Get museums to reflect on the dead and to tell their story as those living in power would have it be told. That's what I see happening here. Entombed people, histories, and movements get museums to reflect on the dead and to tell their story as those living in power would have it be told. And I think I did link this article in the show description so folks can come back and read it in its entirety. Just quickly here, museums and universities are one of the tools responsible for the production of modern systems of knowledge and have helped to establish and maintain the control of knowledge and its production by the West, placing themselves as a very powerful epistemic technology. Only through the political activism and social movements of the 1960s and 70s in the US criticizing museum displays of Native Americans did universities and museums slowly shift their viewpoints to support the cultural self-determination of Native peoples. Like museums, the foundations of universities remain unshakably colonial. And what they argue in this article is so slick. One of the things that they argue is done is so slick, and it gets exactly, and I put the quotes separately here. I'm going to skip to these conclusions. Let me but I do encourage that more of these kinds of articles be read and engaged and maybe taking more time with than I'm even doing here. In this context of the hip hop 50th anniversary and the colonization of Black and brown people here in the United States and elsewhere. Okay, here's one of the points I wanted to highlight. Western memory was constructed, preserved, and transmitted to future generations through the history of art, while objects with non-European origins were largely represented in natural history museums, and only later did anthropological and ethnographic museums place non-Western and non-modern subjects elevated by the progressivist view into categories between the natural and the civilized worlds. That's exactly what I see happening with hip-hop, by the way. I mean, that, again, said differently, this is not about commemorating Black people, Black women in hip hop. This is about entombing the dead so that they can be remembered as those in power want them to be remembered. And when this idea, we're not putting you're not in an art museum as art is defined by Western colonial standards. You're being put in one of those lesser natural history museums, Black history, hip hop history, as an anthropological and ethnographic museum where non-Western and non-modern subjects can be, quote unquote, elevated by the progressivist views between the natural and civilized world. So it's like saying this semi-savage has produced something in the context of our colonial authority that we find of value. And without changing one bit the material condition, in fact, enriching us, we can seemingly praise them. In fact, they are praising the hip hop world for producing an outlet for Black rage that doesn't upset Black relationships and actually increases the wealth and symbolic and intellectual authority of the colonial rule. I mean, it is. So as they said here, with respect to such identity building processes as they, because they talk, this article does I think a fascinating job of talking about, again, like my old professor iMWiL Bakari told me at the Africana Studies and Research Center at the time, under the directorship of its founding director, Dr. James Turner, the Western world needs African art to self-identify as special, as beautiful, as powerful. They judge themselves by how much of their colonial artifacts they get to keep. Similar messages, similar points are made in this article, and they say here primarily that their interest is primarily not in what actually happened in history, but how we remember it. That's what is happening here. They don't give a damn about what Black people in Pan-African communities have done in the struggle against them, against their conditions. They care about how it's remembered as something that led to a new world, that made things better, even as they're not. Even as they're absolutely not. However, modern Eurocentric knowledge implies that culture, ethnicity, and race are fixed identities within imagined national borders. Consequently, a modern idea of the nation state with its linear notion of history, fueled through the Western process of industrialization, became the narrow perspective of the human progression and civilizing framework. Why I thought this point is so well suited to the point I'm making is that the article ends up talking about, again, how the world does not actually operate under, in reality, does not exist under the labeling of Western European imperialism. That we are only Nigerians, Cambodians, Black Americans, Panamanians because of European Western colonial rule. Underneath all of that, we're really something very different. Racially, ethnically, culturally, we're human beings that go beyond all of that. But what the museum does is allow for the European nation state to be reconceived as real, and the identities it imposes on people reified themselves, and then seen as the civilizing framework. So the very fact, as I'm seeing it, that hip hop is being institutionalized in mainstream media, in museums, in academic institutions, and et cetera and so forth, is because it is helping reaffirm the U.S. settler colonial project by reaffirming the U.S. as itself a geopolitical entity, and the identities it creates, houses, and imposes as legit themselves. And then it gets to take credit for it. And then, as Josh Myers brought up when we talked about the 1619 Project, you're creating artificial time constraints. 50 years of hip hop, artificially ascribing it to a party, at one party in the Bronx, so that you can wipe away the Pan-African origins of it, the colonial context of it, its connectivity before and after that moment. And then you can isolate it as something that can be put into a damn museum at some point and used against the very people that produced it.
I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like.